Okay, so this video will walk you through some of the basics of SPSS, how to get some descriptive statistics, and how to run an independent groups t-test. In order to do this, you will need to download SPSS. You can get a free trial version for 30 days. So I would recommend when you are assigned to do an SPSS assignment that you don't download it until you are actually assigned to do the SPSS assignment. It will tell you when in class, and then you can download it, and 30 days should be plenty to do all of the analyses that you need to for this class. I have also posted the data for you in this Town of Wise data clean for Moodle. So once you download the free SPSS, you will need to download the data as well. You may need to open SPSS first and then open the data that you downloaded. Sometimes if you just try to open it, it gives you an error because it's not sure which program you need. So I will post links to how to get that free 30-day trial, and I will discuss it in class. But once you have SPSS, it will look like this. There's two different views in SPSS. So you shift the view based on these two tabs down here. The data view shows you the actual data. And so in the data view, each row represents one person's data. Okay, these dots represent missing data, so some people didn't fill it all out. And so we can see if we look at this one right here, this person has 1 year at UVA-Wise, so these headers are the questions. And we can see their responses to each specific question. Again, we have a good amount of missing data, so some people maybe didn't complete the survey thoroughly, or skipped questions, which we'll deal with later. We'll use the data that we've got. Okay, so this is the variable view. So again, you switch based on these two tabs down at the bottom here. And variable view tells you about the pieces of information you have from each person. So I have the variable name and the label are the same here. Q1 indicates which question it is on the survey. So we've got our Town of Wise survey that you have access to on Moodle. Question 1 on the Town of Wise survey is for how many years have you been at Wise? And so the name of that variable is Q1 years at UVA-Wise. There's a couple I've rearranged, and in particular, many of you had questions based on the UVA-Wise roles, so whether they're faculty or students or gender, and I thought age might be another important one. So those I've moved up, but in general, these are in order, and you have the question number here at the beginning so that you can identify the questions that you need to look at. The other thing to look at is this column called values. So years at UVA-Wise was they filled in the blank. But for any that are multiple choice, the values tells you what the options were. So let's go down to question 5A, which I've labeled as importance, current housing, proximity to work. If we want to go through and look at exactly how that question was asked, I'd go back to the survey, look at question 5A, and be able to read the complete question so that I know exactly what that data tells me about. So I want to look at my response options here. I can click on these 3 dots here, and I know that they rated 1 as least important, 2, 3 was neutral, 4, and 5. So I can see what the response options are. This is more important if we're looking at something like UVA-Wise role. So 1 indicated student, 2 indicated faculty or staff, 3 indicated retired or other. For now, we're just comparing 2 groups, so we'll just compare student and faculty, and the retired or other will be excluded from the analyses that we'll do. So that's kind of the basics of where to find information. And again, if you want to look at the actual data, the actual numbers that people put in, you click on this data view, and the variable view tells us kind of about this information. So I'd encourage you to play around, look at the data. The next thing that you're going to need to know how to do is get some basic descriptive statistics. So I don't think we've really used the word descriptives, but you've been calculating these for a while. So mean and standard deviations, frequency tables, and histograms, those are all descriptive statistics. They're describing the data. And we can have SPSS actually calculate these for us. So let's take an example of Maybe we want to know whether there are gender differences in how important people rate, I don't know, let's go with shopping in their current housing situation. Okay, so are there gender differences in how important people say that shopping was in making their current housing decision? So I'm going to be looking at question 19, which tells us about gender, and then question 5J, which tells us about their ratings of importance of shopping. So the first thing I might want to do is just know how many people am I dealing with, how many men, how many women, and what are the kind of the average ratings of shopping. So in order to get descriptive statistics, I'm going to go to Analyze and Descriptive Statistics. And probably the two that I will use are frequencies and descriptives. So I can go to frequencies, and when you get these windows popped up, you can stretch them out so you can see the full variables, but you can see the variable names. And basically this on the left is a list of all possible variables. And to the right are the variables that you're actually gathering data about. So we said we were interested in gender. So either I can double click on gender, I can click and drag, or I can click on it and use this arrow right here to move it over. Gender, and we were looking at shopping in the current housing. If you get one you didn't mean to, or something like that, you want to run a different analysis, you can always move it back over using the same arrow. And so if we just click OK, it pops up a separate window called output. Okay, so we've got our data window down here, and then we have our output window. And so it gives us some important information. So this is the N, the number of individuals. This tells us how many are valid and how many are missing. So we've got a bunch of people who didn't tell us about gender, but we've got 166 people that we have gender reported on, 197 people reported on housing. We can see the responses. So this gives us a lot of things that we talked about way back in the first few chapters when we talked about frequency distribution tables. So we've got the frequency of people who rated or identified themselves as male and female, transgender, non-binary. Some prefer not to say, and then we have a number of missing. For this case, we need to do two groups. So we're going to compare male, female, and just exclude the other ones for the purposes of these analyses. But if we look at these responses as a whole, it tells us what percentage of responses were male and what percentages were female. It tells us the valid percent. So the percent is out of the total 230 cases, but not everyone reported on their gender. So the valid percent is the percent out of the people who reported on their gender. And then we can also see cumulative percent, which you know how to calculate because we've done that. We can see the same for the importance of shopping in their current housing. So we can see how many people rated shopping as 1 versus 2, 3, 4, and 5 in terms of how important it was. And again, we can see the percent out of total, the valid percent out of the people who actually responded, and the cumulative percent. So that gives us the frequencies. We might describe these in some basic descriptive statistics. But we might also want to include the mean and standard deviation. So we can get those by going to Analyze, Descriptive Statistic, and Descriptives. And so again, just like the other one, we move over the variables that we're interested in. And in this case, we are interested in gender and question 5J. We're going to say OK. So it pops up in that same output window. And what the descriptive statistics gives us is for each one of our variables that we include in there, it gives us the N, or the number of people who responded. It gives us the minimum and the maximum, so we can look at the range, and the mean and the standard deviation. Now, the mean and standard deviation for gender doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we're more interested in that for our continuous variables and our outcome variables. So remember that 1 for the importance of shopping in their current housing situation, a 1 was least important and a 5 was most important. and our mean was 3.25, and our standard deviation was 1.19. So we may be kind of interested in doing some other comparisons where we might look at the importance of shopping versus healthcare in your current housing. And so then you might report these means. And you may just kind of generally interpret this by saying, okay, well, if 3 is neutral, most people are relatively neutral in how important shopping was in deciding their current housing. So do some kind of thinking about that and interpreting of that. Okay, so next we're going to talk about how do we run an independent groups t-test. So remember, an independent groups t-test is where we have 2 separate groups and we're comparing their responses on one outcome. So in this case, we're comparing the responses of people who identified as men versus women. And again, we're excluding anyone who didn't fit into one of those 2 categories for this. And so we're comparing the responses of men versus women in how important they said housing was in deciding, or sorry, how important they said shopping was in deciding their current housing situation. Okay, so we're going to analyze again, and you can click on analyze from, you'll notice that these window options are basically the same from either your data or from the output, and it should get you the same situation. So we're going to analyze, and we're going to go to compare means. And we have 2 samples. So we're going to do what's called an independent samples t-test. So again, you go to analyze, compare means, and an independent samples t-test, meaning we're making a comparison between 2 groups that are separate. They're not overlapping. Okay, so here it's asking you for 2 things. It's asking you for your test variable, which is the outcome. It's kind of what you want to know, is there a difference on? And it's asking you for the grouping variable. How are you making the group? So I always start with the grouping variable. And of course, we're comparing men versus women on gender. So we move gender down here to our grouping variable. So again, you can click and drag it, or you can use this arrow to tell it, I want it in this window down here. The next thing you need to do is define your groups. You might need to check the values. I know that men we coded as 1 and women we coded as 2, I believe. So those are the 2 groups I'm comparing, but if you're not sure, you can go back to your variable view and take a look. Okay, we've got 1 is male and 2 is female. Those are the 2 groups I'm going to compare. So that's what I'm going to put in. If you're comparing students versus employees, you need to go look at the UVA-wise role, look at the values, click on those 3 bars, and you can see, okay, students is 1, faculty and staff is 2. So let's go back here. We're comparing means and doing an independent samples t-test. We are comparing men versus women. Those are our groups. And we're comparing them on the importance of shopping in their current housing situation. So my test variable is going to be shopping. My grouping variable is gender. You don't need to worry about any of the other options for right now. Just click OK, and that should give us the information that we need. All right, so we get a bunch of things, and I want to kind of take a second to talk about what some of these things are. I'm going to try to annotate this and hope that's helpful. So one is it gives us descriptive statistics, but it gives us some useful new descriptive statistics. So first, it breaks up the ratings of importance of housing by our test variable or by gender. So now I have the end. So I have 90 men and 60 men and 93 women. It gives us the mean, and this mean is specific to men. So our average on the importance of shopping for men was 2.99. The mean of importance of shopping for women was 3.44. So it looks like we've got some mean differences here. So this is going to be important. This is something that you might think about graphing, right? A nice bar graph showing the mean of men versus women would really be potentially helpful for the town of Wise to look and say, oh, look, it looks like women are maybe rating shopping as more important than men. It also gives us a standard deviation and the standard error for each group. Those are less relevant to what we're talking about, but these means here broken up by gender are very important. You might also include the N values as well. Okay, so next it gives us our independent samples t-test. Remember, we're looking, the first test is the Levene's test for equality of variances. And remember, we want that test to be non-significant. If it's non-significant, it says the variance between the two groups are roughly similar, which in fact they are. I will tell you, well, so this one says SIG. You'll see SPSS indicates it as either SIG or P. So you may see both, but in this case it says SIG. Of course, it's bigger than 0.05, which tells us there's no significant difference between the variance for men versus women. And that t-value is, so that's not significant. So we basically, what we want to do is we want that t-value for Levene's test for equality of variance to be non-significant. And in that case, we use this top line, okay? Sometimes you may find it's significant, in which case you would use this bottom line. So you only use the bottom line if equal variances are not assumed, if this test is significant. If the test is not significant, we use this top line. Okay, so once we've established, okay, this is not significant, then we're going to ignore this bottom line. We can just pretend it's not there. We're only looking at the top line. And SPSS has actually calculated our t-value. Okay, we've got a t-value of minus 2.607. It's calculated our degrees of freedom of 151. And it has calculated the significance level. Now, we don't actually have to go into a table. It actually tells us the specific p-value associated with this t. So instead of looking at a cutoff and saying, okay, we set our alpha at 0.05, here's the t associated with that alpha, and is the obtained t smaller? What SPSS does is calculates your obtained t and says, okay, what is the likelihood of getting that obtained t? It gives us one-sided versus two-sided. We're gonna generally do two-sided tests. I'd say we'll always do two-sided tests because that's generally the approach. And so it gives us the specific two-sided piece. So we have a t of minus 2.607 with 151 degrees of freedom. The likelihood of getting that, if our null hypothesis was true, the null hypothesis here is that men and women care equally about shopping, is 0.01. Assuming that we're using an alpha of 0.05, which you will be, that is less than 0.05. So this tells us that we are going to reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference in men versus women in the importance of shopping. SPSS also calculates the mean difference and the standard error of the difference. You don't really need to do anything with those. I'm going to clear my annotations here, but a couple more things that I want to point out. SPSS also gives you the confidence interval of the difference. So basically what this is saying is there is a difference of 0.5075 in men versus women's ratings of the importance of shopping. The confidence interval is saying in the population, we believe the difference is somewhere between minus 0.89 and minus 0.12. Again, you probably won't spend a lot of time on that. It's not really something we're going to do anything with, but we've talked a little bit about confidence intervals, so I just wanted to point out where that was. The other thing it's worth pointing out is SPSS also gives us effect sizes. Okay, we've only talked about Cohen's d, so that's the one that we will use. And what we're going to use, the actual estimate of Cohen's d is this point estimate. Whoops. Okay, so the point estimate of Cohen's d is minus 4.32. So what this is telling us is that we have a Cohen's d of 0.432, and which is a moderate effect size. It's saying that basically the difference is about a little less than half a standard deviation. The confidence interval here is the confidence interval for Cohen's d. Generally, we use that point estimate. Okay, so you have the measure of Cohen's d as well. So you can kind of, based on that, what we can conclude is that women rate shopping as significantly more important than men. We know that's significant with a t-value of minus 0.607 with 151 degrees of freedom. The two-sided p-value is 0.01, which is less than 0.05. And it has a moderate effect size of 0.432. Okay, so this is a significant difference. This is worth talking about. Why did men rate shopping as less important? What might that imply in terms of what the town might conclude? So this would certainly be something to report. Again, you would think about potentially graphing the two means so that we can look at those differences between the two means. And I think that's worth talking about. And again, since what you're doing with this data is putting it into the infographic form, anything you can do to visualize data is really good. Now, in terms of how to save this output, you can save it as an SPSS file, but the downside is once your SPSS trial expires, it probably won't open. So what I recommend doing is copying and pasting your responses into Word. So what I would do is I would open up a new Word document, go to your output file, click on, make sure you've got a red arrow there where you're clicked on one of your pieces of your output, and hit Control A, which will select it all. So Control A, then hit Control C, which will copy it. Go into Microsoft Word and hit Control V, which will paste it. Okay, now you have all of that output saved in Microsoft Word, or if you use another word processing program, you can do it there too. But you want to save it as a Word document so you can access it even after your SPSS trial expires. Even if you still have SPSS, you may kind of go back and say, oh my gosh, I'm not sure what I did. If you use it in Word, you can kind of annotate it. You could probably use, well, you won't be able to run SPSS on your iPad, but you could use Notability or something like that after you've run your analyses to annotate it if you need to. So hopefully this gives you a good starting point and gives you the step-by-step instructions that you need to start looking at the descriptive statistics for your data and run an independent samples t-test.